Thank you so much. I'm Joni Siani, and I'm a professor of media, communication, and psychology at Manhattanville College, and I'm so thrilled to be able to do this because we're going to resolve the entire problem with fake news and misinformation in 1 hour. So, right? So we're going to make this very interactive. We are absolutely going to start with our big thinkers over here who have been channeling all of their research and thoughts in such an active way. And for all of those of you who know David, it's all about the action. You know, we can sit all day long and ponder and think and pontificate, but unless we take that somewhere else, we're not going to advance some of these issues. So I'm going to do a brief introduction here. I'll start with Kenneth. That's how we say it. That's how you say Kenneth. In Welsh, okay? Kenneth Bowles is a London-based designer and writer focusing on the ethics of future technologies. You have worked at Twitter. You straightening them out? Not anymore. Okay. Twitter, Samsung, the BBC. Of course, he's a wonderful speaker at any of these tech conferences. And congratulations on your new book, Future Ethics. So Future Ethics is out and available, okay? Andrew, down at the end over there, a consultant, reporter, sociologist, software executive. He's at the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, visiting research fellow at the Shorenstein Center at Harvard, and principal of Working Paper. And I love this line. I think we're all here working at the intersection of journalistic business models and new ways to inform the public. So thank you so much. Mo Johnson over here, an advocate for cooperative, multi-generational communities. And I was interested here in that your work for infectious disease research is the thing that motivated you for expanding your global perspective on ethics and social justice. And you moved to action, too, doing the Global Data Ethics Project. So, again, it's all about moving to the next level. We got to get you guys working out there. And Paul Glader is a journalist, professor, entrepreneur, based right here in New York City. And you have a new project that I couldn't wait to check out called vetnews.com. Vetnews.com. And that is, as a media literacy professor for too many years and pushing media literacy legislation for education in schools, I really was fascinated with that. So check that out. And also aiming to make citizens more media literate, media companies more transparent, and you are also the Associate Professor of Journalism, Media, and Entrepreneurship at the King's College here in New York, and you direct the Business Reporting Program for the Dow Jones News Fund at NYU, and great insight, thank you for your work at the Wall Street Journal, 10 years working there. So again, let's give it up to our panels. They have an amazing amount of experience and research, and people who have done these jobs have seen it all. And we're going to get started, first of all, with the first question. And I was inspired with this question watching an interview with Daniel Radcliffe, for those of you who are visiting in New York, because he's now starring in The Lifespan of a Fact. It's based on a true story. And as we're talking about truth and facts, one of the things that he was saying is, how can we elevate this conversation today to make this a productive conversation without us falling into, anytime we seem to say the words facts and truth, it morphs a little bit into a political discussion. So I'm going to throw that out there to you. How can we elevate the discussion beyond our silos so that when we're talking about the importance, how do we elevate this conversation so it doesn't just fall back into that? Who wants to take that one? Paul?
Okay, so we were talking about that question briefly, and I think parts of journalistic coverage are different than others, where, you know, I think politics and culture zones, there's a lot more argument and disagreement, and certain and some facts are maybe hard to obtain, where there's other parts of coverage covering school boards or crime or business or sports where it's pretty easy to verify certain facts, like Babe Ruth hit a home run, or, you know, the school board passed a certain bill that does X, Y, Z. So I think in short, I think the answer is media literacy, to teach people how to obtain facts. And just to make a comment about those two speakers we heard from already, I was thinking about, where did the best brands in journalism, why did they get to be that way? A lot of citizens, I think, don't really know right now. And a lot of citizens maybe even resent, why is the New York Times or MSNBC or NBC, why are those the ivory tower, the people on high? And I just wanted to make a point that they became that way because of the ethics and integrity that humans developed over decades, and around truth and information and news and information that was accurate and informed people. So now that that's disaggregated, those winners are struggling because the winners now are those with the best SEO or other things in the tech age. So I think we're in an age here where we're capturing how does ethics matter in news and information, and how do citizens understand these categories, why media brands, certain companies do what they do, which ones do a better job than others. So it's I think, but to answer your question, I think people are really confused, but there is hope that we can educate ourselves and others to be more savvy about these, what is truth, what is fact.
Anybody have a comment on that or follow up? Okay, so as I'm listening to you, my question then is going to go right into, do we have some of these big platforms like Facebook and Twitter and all the social media platforms, did we have a problem with the level of power that they all have now, and was some of the problems stemming from a lack of ethics during the development of social media? Anyone want to take that?
Maybe I'll just make one comment that I think will tee up my colleagues here. I think the big social media platforms are now the arbiters of news and information and taken that power out of the hands of publishers, and had been agnostic, kind of. We want information to be free, and everyone's a journalist, everyone has a voice, and that's powerful, and that's partly wonderful. But in terms of news, which takes more money and time and some training to produce well, I think these big platforms are now in the unfortunate situation of, are they public utilities and remain agnostic and allow all information to travel freely, or do they have to take on the role of a publisher, more of an arbiter of what is accurate, who's violating rules or standards or ethics? I think they're in a tricky spot.
So yeah, that is the question. So should they?
So we were just speaking about this briefly, and I want to try to make maybe a backwards argument for platforms to get involved in editorializing, if you will. People are, I think, rightly concerned that there are a very small number of platforms, and that means that they're aggregating their power. And do we really want 4 or 5 companies in the world to be making the choices for everyone? I think that's a really valid concern. I think, though, that is maybe 4 or 5 times as many different choices than an individual would have had 25, 30 years ago in a single geography. So if you lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where I grew up, or let's say you live in Chicago, where I live now, there were 2 major newspapers, and there were some television stations, but mostly there were 2 major newspapers. That was what you got in the morning. Maybe you subscribed to a national paper that 30 years ago you could also get delivered to you. So we're at the kind of same number of editorial voices that could actually reach you. So is it a good thing that there'd be a very small number of tech companies that were taking editorial control over you? No, it's not. But I don't think that's actually so different than it ever was. So by having a small number, we may be actually having more, which is my argument to answer your question of, that is why I would argue that these large tech platforms need to figure out what their editorial role would be, and that some sort of libertarian approach isn't an editorial role, and that's no longer acceptable.
That's what a interesting way, though, to say it's really funny because when this all started out, remember it was the open platform and everyone has a voice and we'll have all these different points of view and that will be great. But then, as we know, in our history of deregulation, now all of a sudden it just trickles down into a very small amount of
and
aggregators.
That's what's really interesting to me, and I will only say this tiny bit and then stop talking. We can talk about it later. But I did a lot of work on citizen journalism in 2007 to 2010, and really everyone held this up as something that was going to be amazing, and it doesn't work in almost any place. It works in South Korea because there's a whole bunch of interesting historical and political factors that actually lend people to want to contribute to their news. But even in South Korea, it only works for a small part of the politically motivated spectrum. And so we had this idea, I think, that the world has shown us maybe it's not so good. All right.
So I think one thing that's interesting, we're talking about truth and we're talking about big tech, and an aspect of truth right now in an open platform system is what gets seen, which is determined a lot by the algorithms that big tech is putting out. So when we talk about the ethics and integrity of some of the more traditional news organizations, which, as you mentioned, there were 2 in Chicago or maybe 2 in New York, that had time and a lot of players to build that set of operationalized ethics and integrity. Now, if we look at who's developing Facebook's newsfeed, it might be 17 engineers. And I've noticed when we talk about ethics today, and I help manage a community that's talking about ethics every day at Data for Democracy, we're often pairing that word with an attempt to define it. So what are the unintended consequences? What are ethics? And I think those are the questions that we should be asking those 17 engineers, because they're the ones that are putting what is seen in front of our faces.
If I can talk just a little bit about the ideologies at play within the tech industry, because I think they hold a great deal of power. The ideology of neutrality is still pervasive. There is still a presumption that tech companies shouldn't intervene in free speech and in free expression, and essentially they're terrified of taking a stance because they are so beholden to performance metrics, things like that, and those form such a central part of their success criteria to Wall Street, that they perhaps rightly recognize that taking a strong stance on various issues around truth, around harassment, things like that, will cause a political backlash that could threaten 50% of their user base. So this is why historically they've been very reluctant to engage in anything that we would call a political decision, and that we might also call an ethical decision. I think those times are changing. I think they're starting to realize in this highly divided era, and in an era where employees are becoming increasingly politicized and increasingly politically active within their companies, my hunch is that's not going to last for much longer. I welcome that, but it's going to be extraordinarily painful for those companies concerned, and they will see backlash, and we will see fragmentation. We already see it, for instance, with Twitter and Gab, the supposed sort of uncensored free speech platform, which, as we know, is essentially a far-right platform for people who are repeatedly banned by Twitter. But that kind of bifurcation, I think, is likely to happen. Whether it's going to contest this hegemony that Facebook and, well, actually just Facebook, have to a large scale, I don't yet know, but I am hopeful. Let's put it that way.
I was just going to say, just to interject and keep that, we're hearing a lot of theorists now saying that they're almost going to be causing their own demise because there's so much mass information, and they're starting to get the reputation of, I can't trust anything on Facebook and Twitter, so maybe it will all just go away because the humans are going, I've had enough. I can't do that. Is that what we're...
Yeah, just to follow on Kenneth's point, I think it was a very good one that they maintain neutrality for the shareholders, but now that's not working. The economic reality is the shareholders. I mean, you have the executives being hauled before Congress and before Parliament in London.
Right.
You and transparency now on how much the platforms were used for misinformation, and then we had $100 billion stock market loss to Facebook earlier this year. So I think the dam's starting to break, and then you have Alex Jones being kicked off these platforms. You had Twitter cleaning up the huge bot issue. So this year we're seeing, I think to Kenneth's point, and it's not by choice of, not necessarily the choice of these companies, but it's the economic reality. I think they have to do something about this, and the neutrality may not be working from a business standpoint.
Did you have? You had a question over here. Hold on, now.
Yeah.
Do you want to stand up and?
Sorry. Yeah, I guess I had like several reactions to a lot of things you guys were saying. I mean, one of the ones, like you brought up a point about variety as a reason. I think that's sort of like is not really what anyone cares about. I mean, it's not that people are concerned about editorial control on the part of centralized tech companies because they're concerned about variety. I think the difference between the Minneapolis newspaper and YouTube is that YouTube has a much more centralized position, and they can actually leverage their editorial control in a way that YouTube is going to get a lot more lobbying than the Minneapolis newspaper, and so I just don't like so that was one thing.
Okay, so can I jump in with what you just said and what you're saying and what we were talking about before? You just said they have editorial control. Does this mean that anyone who is a platform of mass communication, and if we are getting our news and information from the big tech handful, should we be hiring editors? We talked about that a little bit. Do we need Facebook just said we just hired 20,000 people to work on this, and so do we need? Can you guys refer to that? Do we need editors if we're going to be having?
I also had another reaction to this. I mean, I think that I guess what I think is sort of been missing from the discussion about editorial control is I feel like the framing is okay. The sort of policies that YouTube or Facebook can take is they permit this content or they don't. But really, they can. There's a lot of things they can do in terms of like displaying information about reputation. Just for example, that change the playing field. That don't like. There's a much bigger policy space. And I guess.
Did you want to comment on any? So
I mean,
should
I
they be
agree.
held to the same standards, though? That's the thing. I mean, if they've got this level of power, should they be held to the same editorial standards of any news organization, from your Minneapolis newspaper to YouTube?
Maybe I'll try to take your side for a little bit. I mean, I think they are uncomfortable as publishers because they didn't set out to be publishers, and I kind of agree with you that there's other things they can do than maybe just hire editors. They could license others to do things. They tried to do that with fact checkers, and it didn't work too well. They hired they tried to partner with 5 different fact checking groups, and some of the early studies we're seeing on that, a lot of frustrations between the two. But yeah, like filters. What was the word you used?
I mean, so reputation.
Reputation.
There's this sort of like I think one thing that comes up a lot is that Alex Jones's content is presented like his website looks like Fox News' website or MSNBC's website. It's sort of being presented alongside, and there's not. Is that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my overall thought is that tech has gotten us into this current situation with news and information and can help us solve it. And it could take different shapes and forms. And I think I'll leave it at that if others want to comment.
Yeah, I'd like to chip in something if I may. I think a lot of these issues are actually structural issues of the internet. It's unfortunate that it has landed on these tech giants to have to try and solve. I think there are all sorts of problems with them trying to solve it. But the idea that, as you say, InfoWars has a similar visual design, similar visual presentation, and therefore similar level of credibility, is a structural difficulty with the internet. It used to be that we could identify crankish propaganda because it was poorly Xeroxed and handed out on street corners and things like that. Now it bears the legitimacy of any source. And all of these sources are simply one click away. And so the internet has this capability really baked into the underlying structures that there is a habit of tearing apart centralized narratives, if you like, and allowing the user or the reader to reassemble whatever narrative, whatever fiction or fact they choose to stitch together. And tech companies are always going to be fighting against that grain, I think. It's going to be very difficult to address that without completely reshaping the way the web and the internet work.
There's a couple questions out there.
You want to go first? I don't know. Then I can answer. Okay, great. Sorry. So the other thing with the question, should the tech companies be held to the same editorial standards as journalistic, like newspapers and magazines? My understanding is that journalists for a long time have been subject to a certain set of codes of ethics that they have to face. And I know we talked about in the very first lightning talk, I think it was called, that the tech companies, the technologists, and particularly the data scientists who are creating these technologies that we're using, all of us probably have a smartphone, we probably swiped through Facebook this morning, that probably the question might not be, do we need to hold them to the same editorial standards? Is that we need to hold the tech industry to the same standards we've traditionally held other industries, which is to develop a set of codes or principles or ethics that everybody can discuss, agree or disagree, but come to some type of consensus on. And that will include anybody from the 20,000 content moderators that Facebook hired, which aren't editors in the same way that journalists hire editors, to the people designing the algorithms. And I think that's why the call to have a pledge to bring in voices to the table that are participating in all aspects of the data and tech lifecycle are so important right now.
Have you all, four of you, thought about what that pledge might sound like?
We have a pledge written.
You do?
Yes.
There you go.
So
Well,
anybody
I
can
told
sign
you
it.
we're going to solve everything before we ended here
but
today.
it's step one, right?
Yeah.
The pledge is step one. It's getting people to the table to discuss, to sign, to say, hey, I'm here and I'm interested in this. And step two is operationalizing it. So figuring out what can somebody do physically and concretely as a technologist to change the way that we're looking at truth, or trust is the word I'd prefer to use. Yes, and so now we have a bunch of questions.
Yeah, and that's Data for Democracy, right?
Data for Democracy.
Okay.
You can sign the pledge there.
All right. You guys can stand up. We're small enough here. You want to stand up and ask your question, or?
So this, I guess, is in response to Andrew when you were talking about the Minneapolis newspaper that so the way I interpreted that story was more that it was broken then in certain ways, and it's broken now in different ways, maybe, right? So less that relative to that structure, it's better now, and more, right, that different issues historically, right? And so I guess my question is like, what is the ideal way to, and it is a big question, I guess, broadly for all of you, like, I don't even know if this is working. What is the, okay. What is the ideal system for the production, dissemination of news, right? So, and then and sites of discourse and all of that, like more structurally, more formally, what is the ideal? If it was good then in certain ways because there was a level of transparency and news was being produced formally, and everyone at least understood what facts were at play, and now it's good in other ways because people are empowered with voice. What is the ideal, as opposed to you saying it was better then? What is the aspiration?
Thanks for that. I think it's a very fair reframing to say that it was bad then and it's bad now. The reason why I think that's a useful frame, however, is that I think very frequently we're caught up in the idea that our hair is on fire and that it's worse than it's ever been, and that we're in this unique moment of extreme danger. We may be in a moment of extreme danger. It may not be so unique. And what is the ideal mode of editorializing? Yeah, there isn't. There never will be. I think it only works if we have a lot of dissension around what that actually looks like. We need more of some of what we used to do, where there was some sense of trusted authority that is gone. We also need to keep some of what we've achieved, which is really a large number of voices and the ability to access more than you ever could. And how we strike that balance, I think no one has any idea, and I don't think there will be a balance to be struck. I think if anything, the tech has shown us it may be different for literally every human. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to cop out on answering your question, but I don't think there's a great answer.
Do we have another question?
One of my words in this whole tech is provenance. We ought to be better, and both the general audience and also experts, in asking what is the source of the data, what is the source of the information, what is the expertise that opinion leaders come with. Because I think the media, traditional media, we had journalists, they had experience, they had maturity, they had credibility. But now everyone can chip in his or her view, and we ourselves should be better at simply asking on what basis do they offer their opinions, because without some kind of knowledge or expertise, we have a right to
Well, that's like journalism rule number one. Consider the source, right? And when we have media literacy with kids growing up, that should, as you're saying, who are you saying this, and what is your objective of writing about this and passing it on? So media literacy education is what you were saying, right, Paul? That's where it starts. So we're working on that too. I want to just kind of move things along so we have enough questions, but did you have one quick thing, Miles?
Yeah, I just thought on that topic, I think it's really interesting because one of the things that's sort of, I feel like is problematic for super aggregators, like you could think of Facebook, Amazon, Spotify are all aggregating, right, all of demand, and then that changes what supply is actually interacting with that demand. So you have all these super aggregators, and what they've done through having a standardized user interface is they've almost anonymized the actual sources of information. So there's like the issue of reputation, which needs to be figured out. But if you present information in a completely standardized way, it anonymizes the underlying source. So people just consider the source to be the aggregator, not the thing that's being aggregated. And I'm curious, like, what you guys have thought about, whether it's work at Twitter or other places, like, what accountability do these platforms have to, like, anonymize, which is sort of almost the precursor to even being able to evaluate the credibility of the source, right? Is to even know what the source is.
It's a good question, and I'll turn over. I just wanted to add one layer before we break into discussion groups or whatever we're doing. Something that hasn't come up really yet is an issue of inequality. I think maybe like inequality of information. Like rich people have always, news and information, good information, like good intel is expensive to produce, and that's true of journalism. It takes, a lot of money and people to do it well. And so I just lost my train of thought for a second here. So it's expensive to do. Oh yeah, so the inequality. So inequality, I think, plays out where right now where subscriptions are popular again. After 2016 election, we have what we call a Trump bump in publishing and in journalism. So the New York Times used to have 1 million readers paying to buy the New York Times. It now has 3.5 million, and it's on its way. It says its goal is 10 million readers. So we're having super brands, sort of national brands. So the Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, the Journal, Wall Street Journal, like 5 or 10 brands are kind of on hiring binges and are doing kind of well. But my question is it more left-oriented readers or wealthy readers who are subscribing because they have the available cash and the time to read? And if that's the case, what about the larger, set of Americans?
Do you guys have the answer to that? What do we do about that level of inequality of education, of being a media literate, educated person, and how do we raise that so that it's not just one-sided? Okay, media literacy education needs to be in every school. That's our thing. So we can push for that. That's an action item, and we are pushing for legislation on that. Did you want to add anything, Kenneth?
I did, but I've forgotten it.
Okay, all right. So let's move on. Andrew, you're saying about that feeling of our hair is on fire and what do we do? And over this past week, every time I turned on the news, I was watching somebody being an author or somebody talking about the word fascism, which is such a hair on fire word, from Madeleine Albright, Yale professor Jason Stanley. And the question is that an actual issue brought on over a decade of the way we have been consuming our information today? And what happens when we're telling the truth, we're putting out facts, but perception, which is more emotion-based, our perception is no matter what we keep saying, here are the facts, if nobody's wanting to know the facts, are we in this sort of hair on fire place that we've kind of been like, oh, okay, I don't even know what to do? I mean, where's our society today?
Seeing as I'm holding the mic,
Yeah.
I'll use that prerogative. I do think the obvious and the apparent increase in extremism is partly caused by some of these habits of tech platforms, and partly that apophenic structure of the internet where, you know, it sort of breaks down centralized narratives and people can stitch together their own truth. I think it's there is an interesting and difficult point related to the lady's comment about provenance of information and source of information. One counterframing of that is that that's quite an elitist position. If you come on too strongly with credentials and authority, that is to an extent part of the problem. So we've seen this this flourishing of these extremist views partly as a result of that backlash against that, well, if that person can have an opinion, why can't I? Which is absolutely necessitated and privileged by these platforms. So I think that is something that we should recognize tech's complicit role in. And I would say, therefore, there's a moral duty for them to try and counter it as well.
I think one thing if we're going to talk about fascism, I think one thing that's interesting about the propaganda networks that allowed fascism to proliferate historically before tech was that they used facts to weaponize truth. So it's almost like that game that you play where it's like two facts and a lie, or two truths and a lie, and then they use what was almost true to emotionally engage with people. I think I'll let my colleague, whoever y'all are, contribute to this also, but I think one of the things that some of these open platforms and algorithms on the internet allow is this, again, several facts and then this one kind of emotional fact-like thing that can change what somebody perceives as truth to be that or not. And that might be kind of the structural backbone that is allowing some of these more extremist views to arise right now.
I don't have much to say, but just the echo chamber effect that we all know about in tech that serves you up content that echoes your own views or your friends' views is part of the issue. I think we all know.
I want to loop back a little bit to some of our previous conversation about tech solutions in a way of thinking about fascism, et cetera, and maybe we'll all reject that or whatever, we'll see. If we're going to try to answer some of these questions of provenance, if we're going to try to provide some sort of rating of authority that we think is valid or that we can put alongside, if we're going to de-anonymize what's happening, you know, that's presented in YouTube, there is a scale problem, and the only way to solve that scale problem is going to be some form of technology, because that can operate at the same scale as many people are uploading. So there's a lot of projects that have tried to build some sort of semantic details into a piece of content. One that I think is actually trying to do exactly this right now, happening at MIT, is called Underlay. So if you go to underlay.mit.edu, and their intent, which I think is correct but will be murderously difficult to do, is to embed a knowledge graph into other pieces of content so that you can say, okay, well, I'm claiming this fact. Here's where it came from, and here's where that came from, and here's where that came from. And I think that would be extraordinarily helpful, if not almost impossible to actually do, to our, now that I'm looping in every comment, to our earlier point about it being extremely difficult and there may not be any optimal solutions. But that what may be most interesting about a technology like that is that it is a combination of humans choosing to implement it and humans using that very simple markup language or a graph database to help ourselves get to this point of where did that come from, and how that would be so systemically different than media that we've had in the past that was able to stoke fires of, you know, truth, and this little tweak, not truth. If you could go and check it, that would be great. Yeah. But the implementation thereof is so difficult.
What would they describe as the incentives for opting into using that knowledge graph? Like, I can understand the positive outcome of it.
Yeah, so it's like, it comes out of the MIT Press. And so you could see how in an academic writing environment, it would be very advantageous. And it's almost like a better form of citations, which I think is why it comes out of there. And again, that's this really, oh, we got a 15-minute plate. Awesome. You can see where those motives, the almost political and professional motives, are built into that little community. And maybe there's ways of getting it to grow from there, but understand where it's coming from, and also understand that's probably why it's so damn difficult to do. But I kind of wondered maybe if in the community building world, that's where I really wanted to get to in this ridiculously long-winded thing, how we get to some of those combination of human and technology and the motivations to use it. So I thought I had this intuition that you might have something very interesting.
I have a few answers.
Yeah.
So one of the ways to solve it, I think, is well, two things: multiple perspectives from different disciplines. So technologists alone cannot solve this problem. You need psychologists, you need anthropologists, you need people that kind of understand like the emotional tenor of how something affects you. And then you need technologists to integrate and work to try to implement these solutions. Because I think tech has, something that's great about tech is they try things, you get feedback from it, and then you can quickly try something new. The other solution I'd say, and this is partially because the community that I manage is across 24 time zones, and so, which is fun, scheduling stuff, but it also means there's multiple languages. And I know we focused on American news media and stuff like that, but I personally, so I speak Spanish too, I read newspapers that are in other countries to make sure that I'm not getting into my own echo chamber. And I think that's the human solution, is to take that extra 10 minutes and listen to a podcast, whatever, in Italian and Spanish and Chinese somewhere else, where then you're actually also on an individual level training yourself to be more open and inclusive of other viewpoints as you're designing tech or as you're solving this problem.
We do keep coming back to that. I'm going to ask you guys to do something for me, okay, because we are up against the clock and we can mingle again with everybody. But I want you to just have your mind wrapping around that thought that you might have had over the years and stuff. What if we fill in the blank? So a lot of you might have been thinking about solutions, solution-oriented people. And does anyone have anything that, when we're talking about truthfulness, honesty, dissemination of information, does anybody have something that you can fill in the rest of that sentence? What if we... Okay. Anybody else back there? What if we? Okay. And repeat that again. That your first line. What if we? Okay. Okay. I'm just trying to give everybody an opportunity. What was your?
Yeah, I was wondering what if we could have technology empower investigative journalism, and kind of there's so many challenges with the structural issues of the internet, right? It's so kind of assuming that it's very, very hard to change those easily. Like if there were more ways to work in this kind of human technology dimension, and then this sort of forensic efforts that people are doing through tech.
From the forensic from the tech companies.
Yeah, and like kind of letting more people participate in that, so that they can be doing this sort of investigative work that's needed.
Okay. I'm just giving everybody a chance. We'll come back to you. Go ahead. Real loud.
What if we could have dialogue without feeling that we have to compete for what is the truth?
Well, that was brilliant. Right behind you.
What if we change the business model of the internet to not rely on surveillance based ads?
What, say that again really loud.
What if we change the business model of the internet to not rely on surveillance based advertising?
What if, guys, what if we were to change the business model?
This is pet territory for me, and I'm going to disagree with you, I'm afraid. I'm unpopular in tech ethics circles in that I think there is a lot of inaccuracy about the business model being the source of all evil. I think the surveillance rhetoric is deeply unhelpful. I think it undermines actual surveillance, which is much more of a significant threat. My biggest concern with changing business models is the presumption that the only fair business model is one that's funded by the end user is itself discriminatory. And we already have the idea that privacy is becoming a luxury good. We already have the idea that knowledge is becoming a luxury good. And so I will defend absolutely the right for tech companies to try to reach as many people as they can, and that has to be supported by advertising. There is no other business model that will ever work for that.
Benjamin Day had it down back in the day when he first had his newspapers.
So, okay, I kind of agree with you.
See, this is why we do this.
And I'm going to be inflammatory for the sake of being inflammatory without actually, I mean, it's rich to hear that from someone who lives in one of the few places in the world that has truly excellent public service broadcasting. And I say that only as a way of trying to promote that one of the alternatives that we could choose to do as a society is figure out what it is to have a public service broadcaster in the modern age. And you know, I think the BBC, and especially the BBC Trust, has not done the best possible job of figuring out what that looks like in the modern era. And I think a decade ago they were more interested in figuring that out than they are today. But there is that entire space, policy space, solution space, whatever you want to call it, that is not, we haven't yet discussed in this room, that would be an alternative to, you know, that would help us to raise the floor, if you will.
Well,
and so that's kind of cool to hear, but that's what's cool to hear. That argument is like, yeah, go forth, build all this advertising, because you're in a space, maybe because your day-to-day space is this where the floor is raised, which is great.
There's that great scene in Aaron Sorkin's newsroom, right? Where I play this in my class. It's the what if the 112th Congress, when television broadcasting was just getting ready to move forward in their heyday. This was back in the 1940s. If they remembered when they sat in front of Congress to say, you can make a profit for the rest of the day, but 1 hour a day was going to be dedicated to non-commercial for news and information and was not going to be led by any kind of commercial. So I'm just saying, what if we had some more non-commercial?
But just one other tiny
Go ahead.
piece. They're not actually orthogonal, right? The history of the BBC was deeply commercial. It was radio manufacturers that wanted to sell radios and needed the content, and they're like, fine, we don't care about the content. We'll create this licensing scheme to create high-quality content that the government will deal with for us. It was a deeply lowercase c conservative solution from a conservative government that actually produced this amazing public good. And so I don't like that orthogonal.
So is it ethics? Is it more of or the pledge, the ethics? It doesn't matter if it's commercial or not, but it's more about it has to meet a certain standard?
Sure, maybe. I just didn't want to set it up as though like we have to have this one separate thing.
That was my what if.
Fair.
Okay, I'm going to throw a quick what if. What if you, when you're surfing the internet or social media for content, for news content, got a red light, a green light, or a yellow light, that a warning indicator of whether the news organization the news that you're reading is based from a provider or provenance, that was evaluated by humans, right, to find out, does this news organization correct itself when it makes a mistake and is confronted with that fact that it makes a mistake? Does it have a code of ethics and standards it makes visible to you, the public, on its site, and where is that? Where's the links? And does it delineate news and opinion? So that's a what if that I'm working on. That's my vet news product. Vet is a Swedish word that means savvy, so we're trying to make citizens savvy about the news they read on the online. And I'll say one finding so far from our first 50 audits of news, some of the biggest news providers, is we found that unfortunately not enough news providers have put their standards and ethics online. Some of them, the New Yorker, for example, gets a yellow under our rating at present, even though it's a great magazine. We think they could be more transparent with the public. So it's not all big tech's fault. I think media has to do a better job too, and we're trying to help them do that.
I want to take a moment, because we're talking about BBC and big tech and New York Times, to actually re-highlight the question that your social worker raised about centering marginalized voices, because I think some of those voices have traditionally been absent from some of these entities that we're naming and we're trying to find solutions for. And a quick answer to your question is, I think, well, two. One, in our community that I help manage, we do have social workers that bring up some of these issues. So please join. Two, I do think when we talk about ethics and solutions, this has to be intersectional with some of the historical injustices that have been done to depreciate some of the voices that have not been and are not currently present in both the people writing the news, the people making the algorithms, and the people that get to decide what gets put in front of our faces. So this is just a big plug to be intersectional.
Nice. Yeah. Can I just chip in one?
You have to.
Okay, one. What if we?
Okay.
What if we found a way to demetricize the news and tech industries?
You can't leave us with that. What if we did then?
Well, I think it would go some way to resolving many of these problems. The algorithm, capital T, capital A, is what is driving a lot of, say, YouTube's recommendations towards extremist content, towards misinformation, because they are appealing, they're attractive, in that they generate engagement. And so it is the chasing of metrics and engagement and KPIs and OKRs, or whatever you call them in your industry, that is partly responsible.
That's just an argument that the metrics are the wrong ones, and because you can't not have any metric. You must have something. We're human beings. We respond to these things. So isn't then the argument we should have a metric, for example, that actually tracks what someone learns? We should actually figure out how to.
Sure. You have something to say, young man.
Well, so just. You talked about not being able to modify the business model, but if the companies, either the producers of the content or the people that are disseminating it, can't hide behind shareholder value as their overarching mission, then that solves many of these problems.
And it's just a shift. We just have, I just think your argument is actually the reverse. And we must have metrics. They just have to be different ones.
And maybe we should be targeting the investors and demanding that they become more ethical and change the metrics through which they make money.
Well, we're seeing that now. We're seeing that play out on Wall Street when.
Saudi journalists.
Yeah. Okay. So we have 5 minutes. I've got 5 minutes, and I wanted. Did you have one more? You were dropping your mic way too early.
Yeah, sorry.
So would you like him to expand? And okay. So expand that before you drop your mic.
Okay, I'm worried because this could get political. There are pressures from Wall Street for tech companies particularly to report certain things on earnings calls that show numbers going up and to the right. And from my experience at Twitter, that causes pretty much every ethical problem within a company like Twitter. Everything is the business case's fault. And ultimately, you can have a kind of root cause analysis and say that that's necessitated by capitalism, or it's necessitated by being a listed public company, etc. But while those models are in place, and while tech companies feel they have to be beholden to metrics because the board reports to Wall Street, etc., I don't see a way of squaring that circle. So my what if we was very, very much hypothetical. What if we find a way that that concern no longer exerts its heavy influence over the way that that company designs and builds products? If they can find a way to liberate themselves from the yoke of having to hit these damn targets, I think they're in a much better position to behave ethically.
We just got our times up, little plate, but we are going to be mingling, and I wanted to thank you guys for participating. Of course, it doesn't move until we're getting together, and thanking our panel.
Can I do one super off-topic random thing? There
You
are
can.
more cool glasses in the audience than I have seen in one room, and I don't know how long. Like, the bright blue are awesome. The like bold black are really cool. I don't even know, it's like tortoiseshell. I'm just saying, look around. There are really cool glasses in the audience everywhere. That's all. Okay.
Thank you guys so much, and let's continue as we mingle throughout the day.